Audrey Kincaid had exactly 14 days to disappear before Lucas Fairmont married another woman, and she'd already written the resignation letter that would save what remained of her heart. 9 years, 9 months, and 4 days of loving him in silence had taught her the precise shade of his eyes, the rhythm of his breathing when he slept in the library chair, and the devastating truth that he saw her as nothing more than the quiet girl in blue who poured his tea. But the decision was made. She would accept the Yorkshire post, leave at month's end, and take with her the terrible sweet burden of a love he would never know existed. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. The soft late summer afternoon light had drawn long, fading gold across the parquet floors of the Fairmont Estate's grand receiving hall, bathing the marble busts and oil portraits in a deceptive tranquility. And yet, the air was heavy with the coming change. Audrey Kincaid, dressed in a subdued favorite soft blue, sat at the pianoforte, her fingers stilled above the keys, her gaze fixed on the man in the bay window as he had sat 1,000 afternoons before, his profile sharp and formal against the fading light. Lucas Fairmont, reserved and dutiful, stood utterly unaware of her observation, as he had been unaware for 9 years, 9 months, and 4 days, though Audrey no longer required the calendar to track the immense expanse of her devotion. The light caught the severe line of his tailored jacket and the rigid set of his shoulders, marks of time passing under the crushing weight of expectation which she had witnessed in their gradual hardening. She knew the particular way his knuckles whitened when he grasped his cane, the brief, weary furrow between his brows when estate matters overwhelmed him, and the precise moment his breathing would deepen into slumber on the nights she was tasked with reading aloud. How many times had she catalogued the precise shade of his brown eyes, the faint scar above his left temple, the elegant, cold symmetry of his appearance? How many times had she imagined speaking his given name aloud? Not the formal Mr. Fairmont, that propriety demanded, but Lucas, just Lucas, whispered in tones of agonizing, secret tenderness. The afternoon silence pressed in, a profound, isolating vacuum, and Audrey felt the weight of her secret love. A terrible sweet burden pressed against her ribs, heavy as gold, sharp as a wound that refuses to heal. She had mastered the art of invisibility, arranging his world with quiet hands he never noticed, loving him with a fidelity he would never know, existing in the quiet, essential margins of his magnificent, unreachable life. But the decision had been made, sitting in this very chair 2 weeks ago while he dictated letters, and she faced at last the truth she had been fleeing. She could not bear another year of this slow burn of silent yearning, this beautiful, devastating proximity to everything she wanted and could never truly possess. She would accept the position in Yorkshire and leave at the end of the month. The resolution sat in her chest like cold, necessary iron. 2 weeks remained to memorize every detail of him, to gather these last moments like fragile flowers pressed between the pages of memory, and then Audrey Kincaid would disappear. The pianoforte keys were cool beneath Audrey's fingertips, and the memory rose unbidden, sharp and vivid as the day itself. 9 years ago, she had arrived at Fairmont Estate in a hired carriage that rattled up the long, tree-lined drive in the grey wash of an October morning, her morning blacks still crisp and unforgiving, her heart hollowed out by the sudden brutal loss of her aunt. Mrs. Constance Fairmont had been her only family, the warm, clever woman who had written faithful letters and sent birthday parcels tied with ribbon, and now she was gone. And Audrey had come to pay her respects to a house she had never seen, to a nephew she had never met. She had been received in the very same hall where she now sat, though then the autumn light had been cold and thin, and the marble busts had seemed like silent sentinels of judgment. The butler had taken her small, battered trunk, and she had waited, hands folded, exhausted from grief and travel, unsure of what politeness required of her now that the funeral was done. And then he had appeared. Lucas Fairmont had descended the central staircase with the particular controlled grace of a man who had learned early to carry the weight of duty without complaint. He was 19 then, already severe in his formality, his dark coat perfectly tailored, his expression carefully neutral. But his eyes, those brown eyes she would come to know in every shade of fatigue and fleeting warmth, had held something raw beneath the surface. Grief, yes, but also a kind of rigid determination, as though he were holding himself together by sheer force of will. He had offered his hand, his voice low and steady. "Miss Kincaid, I am deeply sorry for your loss. My aunt spoke of you often and with great fondness." The touch of his hand, even through the formality of gloves, had sent a shock of recognition through her, immediate and inexplicable. It was not merely attraction, though he was handsome in his austere, unreachable way. It was something deeper, something that felt like inevitability, as though her heart had been waiting all her life to meet his, and had recognized him instantly, even as her rational mind understood the unbridgeable distance between them. She had thanked him quietly, and he had released her hand, and she had told herself it was only the vulnerability of grief, the disorientation of loss, that made her feel so utterly unmade by a stranger's courtesy. She had planned to leave the next morning, to return to the modest school where she had been teaching, to her small, unremarkable life. But that evening, as she sat alone in the guest room, there had been a knock at the door. Lucas had stood in the hallway, holding a worn leather journal, his expression uncertain in a way that made him seem, for a fleeting moment, young. "This was my aunt's," he had said. "She kept a private diary. I thought you might wish to have it. She wrote of you frequently." Audrey had taken the journal with trembling hands, and later, by candlelight, she had read her aunt's elegant script, page after page of affectionate observations, small anecdotes, and then, near the end, a passage that had stopped her breath. "If anything should happen to me, I hope Lucas will have the good sense to ask Eleanor's niece to stay. The house needs a woman's warmth, and that boy needs someone who will not demand he be anything other than what he is. Audrey has a gentle heart and a steady hand. She would be a blessing here." The next morning, Lucas had made the offer himself, stiff and formal in the breakfast room, as though he were proposing a business arrangement. The estate required correspondence, household management, companionship for any guests. It was not a formal position, he had explained, but if she were willing, room and board would be provided, and a modest salary. He had looked at her with those careful, guarded eyes, and Audrey, who had no family, no home, no particular prospects, had said yes. She had told herself it was practicality, gratitude, a chance to honor her aunt's memory. But even then, as Lucas had nodded and turned back to his correspondence, she had felt the first stirrings of the truth she would spend 9 years concealing. She had wanted to stay near him. She had wanted to learn the rhythm of his days, the cadence of his voice, the rare fleeting moments when his severity softened into something almost tender. And so she had been given a room on the 2nd floor, modest and comfortable, with a window that overlooked the gardens. She had been invited to take her meals with him when there were no guests, to assist with estate correspondence, to read aloud on quiet evenings, to manage the household accounts that he found tedious. She became a fixture, essential and invisible, a part of the estate's efficient, well-ordered life, and every day the proximity was a kind of exquisite violence. She poured his tea and learned how he preferred it. She mended the torn lining of his favorite coat and felt the warmth of the fabric that had touched his shoulders. She sat across from him at dinner and memorized the way candlelight softened the hard lines of his face. She read poetry aloud and watched his eyes close, his breathing slow, and imagined, foolishly, that her voice brought him peace. 9 years. She had lived in the margins of his world, close enough to see everything, far enough to remain unseen. And the delicious, agonizing proximity had become both her sustenance and her slow, inevitable ruin. The library had settled into its evening stillness, the kind of profound quiet that made even the turning of a page seem intrusive. The lamps were lit, their golden glow pooling on the mahogany desk where Lucas sat, his correspondence spread before him in neat, precise rows. Audrey occupied the chair near the fire, positioned at the angle that had become habitual over the years, close enough to hear him clearly when he dictated, far enough to preserve the illusion of propriety. In her lap lay his study coat, charcoal wool worn soft from use, and she worked her needle through the torn lining of the sleeve with small, careful stitches, her fingers steady, even as her pulse was not. He had handed her the coat an hour ago without preamble, a brief apology for the inconvenience, his mind already turning back to the estate reports that consumed his attention. She had taken it, the fabric still holding the faint warmth of his body, and the intimacy of that warmth had sent a traitorous flutter through her chest. Now, with the coat draped across her knees, she could smell the faint trace of him, wool and ink, and the subtle, clean scent of his soap. And it required all her practiced composure not to press the fabric to her face like some foolish, lovesick girl. "Miss Kincaid," Lucas said, his voice cutting through the silence with calm authority. "If you are ready." "Of course, Mr. Fairmont." She set the coat aside and reached for the writing desk that had been positioned near her chair, pulling it closer, dipping the pen in ink. Her hands moved with the efficiency of long routine, and she waited, eyes on the blank page, her entire awareness narrowed to the sound of his breathing, the rustle of paper as he selected the next letter. "To Mr. Henshaw, estate agent, London," he began, his tone brisk and businesslike. "Dear Sir, I write to confirm receipt of your correspondence dated the 14th instant, regarding the proposed drainage improvements to the southern fields. After due consideration, I am prepared to authorize the expenditure outlined in your estimate, provided the work commences no later than the 1st of October. Audrey's pen moved in smooth, practiced strokes, transcribing his words with the automatic precision born of countless evenings just like this one. She had learned his dictation style years ago, the slight pauses that indicated a new sentence, the particular inflection that meant he was deliberating phrasing. She could anticipate him, sometimes, finish his sentences in her mind before he spoke them, though she never dared voice the thought aloud. He continued, detailing specifications and timelines, his focus absolute, and she was grateful for the task, for the distraction of ink and paper, because it gave her something to do with her hands, some excuse for the way her breath shortened when he leaned forward, when the lamplight caught the angle of his jaw. "Please ensure that all materials are sourced locally where practicable," he went on, "and that the work does not interfere with the autumn planting schedule. I remain, etc. You have the usual closing." "Yes, Mr. Fairmont." He moved to the next letter, and then the next, his voice a low, steady rhythm that wrapped around her like a physical presence. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed the hour, and Audrey felt the familiar bittersweet ache settle deeper into her bones. This was her life, this quiet essential service, this nearness that was no nearness at all. He sat less than 6 feet away, close enough that if she rose and crossed the small space between them, she could touch him, could lay her hand on his shoulder, could feel the warmth of him beneath the fine wool of his waistcoat. But the true distance was infinite. When the last letter was finished, Lucas sat back with a small, weary sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose in a gesture she recognized as fatigue. "Thank you, Miss Kincaid. That will be all for this evening." "Of course." She set down the pen, flexing her ink-stained fingers, and reached again for his coat, taking up her needle. The tear was nearly mended, only a few stitches remaining, and she bent her head to the task, her face carefully averted. She heard him rise, the soft sound of his footsteps on the carpet as he moved to the bookshelf, selecting a volume. Then, instead of retreating to his chair, he crossed toward the fire, and suddenly he was there, standing just beside her, the heat of the flames and the heat of his presence mingling in a way that stole the air from her lungs. "Is the repair very troublesome?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. She looked up, startled by his proximity, and found herself caught in the direct regard of his eyes, brown and serious and utterly without comprehension. For a single suspended moment, their gazes held, and Audrey felt the treacherous hope flare in her chest, the wild, irrational thought that perhaps this time he might see her, truly see her. Not the capable assistant, the reliable companion, but the woman who loved him with every silent, aching fiber of her being. But then his expression shifted, a polite, impersonal concern, and he gave a small, courteous nod. "I do appreciate your skill with such matters. The household would be quite lost without your attention to detail." The household, not him. Not I would be lost. The household. "It is no trouble at all, Mr. Fairmont," she said, and her voice was steady, perfectly modulated, betraying nothing. "I am nearly finished." "Excellent." He turned away, returning to his chair, opening his book, and just like that, she was dismissed. Invisible once more. Audrey bent her head and drove the needle through the final stitch with hands that trembled only slightly, and she told herself, as she had told herself 1,000 times before, that this was enough. It had to be enough. But the lie was growing harder to believe. The disruption arrived on a bright Thursday morning in late August, announced by the clatter of carriage wheels on gravel and the sudden, efficient flurry of servants mobilized by the unexpected visit. Audrey had been arranging late summer roses in the drawing room, her hands occupied with the quiet, meditative work of trimming stems and placing blooms when she heard the commotion in the entrance hall. Through the tall windows, she glimpsed the gleaming black carriage bearing the Fairmont crest, and her heart sank with immediate, instinctive dread. She knew that carriage. Lady Catherine Fairmont, Lucas's formidable mother, had come from London. Within the hour, the drawing room had been transformed from its usual austere tranquillity into a stage set for social performance. Lady Catherine held court in the chair nearest the fireplace, her posture regal despite her travelling clothes, her sharp eyes cataloguing every detail of the room with the critical assessment of a woman who had once ruled this house and had never quite forgiven it for passing to her son. And beside her, perched on the settee with the easy grace of someone accustomed to being admired, sat Miss Evangeline Thorne. She was beautiful. Audrey had understood this within the first glance, and the knowledge had settled in her chest like a stone dropped into dark water. Evangeline Thorne possessed the kind of beauty that was both effortless and meticulously cultivated. Golden hair arranged in perfect ringlets, porcelain skin that had never known labor, a figure displayed to exquisite advantage in a gown of rose silk that must have cost more than Audrey earned in a year. Her laugh was musical, her conversation sprinkled with references to London society, mutual acquaintances, fashionable amusements. She was everything Audrey was not: visible, valuable, relevant. Audrey had served tea with her usual quiet efficiency, moving through the room like a shadow, pouring from the silver service and offering delicate sandwiches that no one acknowledged. Lucas had entered shortly after, summoned by his mother's arrival, and Audrey had watched his expression shift into the particular mask of courteous formality he wore for social obligation. He had greeted Miss Thorne with appropriate politeness, and if there was no warmth in his tone, there was also no objection when Lady Catherine declared that Evangeline would be staying for a fortnight to become better acquainted with the estate. "It is time, Lucas," Lady Catherine had said, her voice carrying the weight of irrefutable authority, "that you considered your duty to the family name. Miss Thorne's father controls significant holdings in Derbyshire, and the connection would be advantageous in every respect. You are 8 and 20. This has been delayed long enough." Lucas had inclined his head, his face unreadable. "I am aware of my obligations, Mother." Now, 3 days later, Audrey stood in the hallway outside Lucas's study, her arms full of correspondence that needed filing, and through the partially open door, she heard the conversation that would crystallize her resolve into something final and irreversible. "You understand, Miss Thorne, that I am not a romantic man." Lucas's voice was measured, almost clinical. "My time is consumed by the management of the estate, and I have little inclination for the social pursuits that occupy London society. If you were to accept an arrangement between us, you should be aware that I would expect a companionable partnership. Nothing more. I appreciate your candor, Mr. Fairmont." Evangeline's voice was smooth, untroubled. "I am not seeking a love match. My father believes this alliance would be mutually beneficial, and I am prepared to fulfill the role of mistress of Fairmont Estate with all the dignity and competence it requires. I believe we understand each other perfectly. Then we are in agreement. I will speak to your father when he arrives next week." There was a pause, the rustle of fabric as someone rose. "I am glad we have settled this so efficiently," Evangeline continued. "It is refreshing to conduct such matters without the tedious pretense of sentiment. I believe we shall deal very well together, Mr. Fairmont. I believe we shall." Audrey stood frozen in the hallway, the letters clutched against her chest, her breath shallow and painful. The words circled in her mind with brutal clarity. Not a romantic man. Companionable partnership. Nothing more. No tedious pretense of sentiment. This was how Lucas Fairmont understood marriage, a transaction, a duty to be discharged. And Miss Evangeline Thorne, beautiful and pragmatic and utterly appropriate, would become his wife, and together they would live out their days in polite, loveless efficiency. And where, in this carefully arranged future, was there any place for Audrey Kincaid? Nowhere. She was not even a consideration, not a variable in the equation. She was the woman who mended his coats and transcribed his letters and poured his tea, and when he married Miss Thorne, she would continue in that role, or perhaps be quietly dismissed to make room for the new mistress's own companions. Either way, she would remain exactly what she had always been. Invisible, irrelevant, a fixture of the household with no more significance than the furniture. The truth of it was devastating in its simplicity. She had spent 9 years loving a man who would marry for advantage and alliance, who had just declared himself incapable of romance, who saw her so little that he had never once suspected the depth of feeling she harbored. She had wasted 9 years waiting for something that would never come, hoping for recognition that would never arrive. Audrey turned away from the study door, her movements mechanical, and walked with deliberate calm toward the small writing desk in the morning room. Her hands shook only slightly as she drew out a sheet of paper and took up her pen. The letter to the headmistress in Yorkshire, offering the teaching position, had arrived 6 months ago. Audrey had kept it, tucked in her private drawer. A possibility she had never quite been able to relinquish. She would write tonight. She would accept. And she would leave Fairmont Estate and Lucas Fairmont and this beautiful, unbearable half-life before her heart finished breaking completely. The letter had been written by candlelight, late in the evening after the house had settled into silence and Audrey could trust that her hands would not shake, that her penmanship would reflect calm professionalism rather than quiet desperation, and she had composed it with care, expressing her gratitude for the headmistress's patience in holding the position open, confirming her acceptance of the post at the small but respectable girls' school in Yorkshire, and providing her anticipated date of arrival. She had sealed it with wax, addressed it in her neat script, and posted it the next morning before courage could fail her. The reply had arrived within the week, brisk and warm, and utterly final. The headmistress was delighted. The position was hers. She was expected by the 28th of September, in time for the autumn term. Room and board would be provided, along with a modest salary that would, for the first time in 9 years, belong entirely to her. The letter had trembled in Audrey's hands as she read it, and she had felt the strange, conflicting surge of relief and grief, liberation and loss. It was done. The decision was no longer abstract. She was leaving. Now, on a grey afternoon that threatened rain, Audrey stood in the modest second-floor room that had been hers since that first autumn, and began the work of dismantling 9 years of her life. The room was simply furnished. A narrow bed with a faded quilt, a small writing desk beneath the window, a wardrobe that had never been filled, a bookshelf that held her few treasured volumes. It had been enough. More than enough. It had been a sanctuary and a prison, a place where she could retreat with her secret and nurture it in solitude, away from the unbearable brightness of Lucas's presence. She had laid her single trunk open on the bed, and now she moved through the space with slow, deliberate motions, taking stock of what little she owned. Her dresses, simple and practical, most of them in shades of blue. Her Sunday best, carefully preserved, a winter cloak, 2 pairs of gloves. The accumulation was pathetically small, the evidence of a life lived in service and shadow, but it was the small things, the invisible things, that undid her. In the top drawer of her writing desk she found the first memento, a ribbon bookmark, forest green silk, that Lucas had given her during her second week at Fairmont Estate. He had noticed her struggling to keep her place in the household accounts ledger, and had offered it with an offhand courtesy, his attention already turning elsewhere. This might prove useful, Miss Kincaid. She had treasured it like a relic, using it faithfully for 9 years, and now the silk was worn soft, fraying slightly at the edges. She folded it carefully and placed it in the corner of the trunk. Beneath a stack of letters from the headmistress was a small pressed flower, a white rose taken from the garden on a June afternoon 3 years ago. Lucas had been walking the grounds with the estate steward, discussing repairs to the south wall, and she had trailed behind at a respectful distance, as was her habit when he did not require her assistance. He had paused beside the rose arbor, and for a fleeting moment his severe expression had softened. "My aunt planted these," he had said, to no one in particular. She loved white roses. Audrey had returned later, alone, and taken a single bloom, pressing it between the pages of her prayer book. It was brittle now, colorless, but she could still recall the exact quality of light that afternoon, the way his voice had gentled with memory. On the bookshelf, she found the volume of Wordsworth's poetry that he had lent her 4 years ago, after hearing her mention that she had never read Tintern Abbey. He had brought it to the library that same evening, placed it in her hands with a rare, almost shy formality. "I think you will appreciate this, Miss Kincaid. Return it when you have finished." She had read it that night, and a dozen nights after, but she had never returned it. He had never asked. She ran her fingers over the worn leather cover, then packed it with reverence. There was a linen handkerchief, monogrammed with his initials, that she had found abandoned in the drawing-room 5 years ago. She had washed and pressed it, intending to return it, but had instead kept it hidden in her drawer, a foolish, stolen comfort. There was a broken pen nib he had discarded, which she had salvaged for no reason other than that his hand had held it. There was a concert program from the single evening he had taken her to hear a visiting pianist, a gesture born purely of obligation when his mother had fallen ill, and he required a respectable companion. Audrey had sat beside him in the dim concert hall, so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and she had barely heard the music over the thundering of her own heart. Each object was a small secret testament to her devotion, and together they formed a mosaic of longing, a chronicle of 9 years spent gathering crumbs of his attention and hoarding them like treasure. She packed them one by one, wrapping the fragile items in layers of tissue, and with each piece she placed in the trunk. She felt the weight of her resolve harden. This was why she had to leave, because she had been collecting fragments of a man who did not love her, building a fantasy from politeness and proximity. And if she stayed, she would spend the rest of her life doing the same, watching him marry another woman, growing old in the margins of his indifference. By the time the afternoon light began to fail, the trunk was half full, and her room looked already like a place she had left. Audrey sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, and allowed herself a single moment of unguarded grief. Then she rose, smoothed her skirts, and returned to the work of departure. There were still 2 weeks remaining. 2 weeks to memorize his face, to hear his voice, to love him in silence one last time before she disappeared. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning, beneath a sky so bright and clear it seemed to mock the violence of what followed. Audrey had been in the still room, reviewing the household accounts, when she heard the shouts from the stable yard, the sudden terrible commotion of raised voices and running feet. She had risen instinctively, her heart already racing with nameless dread, and by the time she reached the kitchen entrance, 2 grooms were carrying Lucas through the door, his face ashen, his riding coat torn and darkened with blood, his body held with the careful urgency of men who feared every movement might worsen an unseen injury. "Send for the doctor," Audrey said, her voice cutting through the chaos with a clarity that surprised even her. "Immediately, and prepare his chamber, fresh linens, hot water, bandages. Quickly now." The housekeeper stared at her, momentarily frozen, and Audrey felt something shift inside her, a cold, necessary authority rising to fill the space where panic threatened. "Mrs. Dawson now. I will attend to Mr. Fairmont." She followed the grooms up the stairs, her skirts gathered in her hands, her mind racing with grim practicalities. In the master chamber, they laid Lucas on the bed with painstaking care, and she could see the extent of it now. The gash above his temple where his head had struck something, the unnatural angle of his left arm, the shallow, labored quality of his breathing. His eyes were closed, his face drained of color, and for one terrible suspended moment, Audrey thought he might be dying. "What happened?" she demanded, her hands already moving to loosen his cravat, to check his pulse at the throat. "His horse spooked at a branch, miss," the older groom said, his voice shaking. "Threw him hard. He hit the fence rail and then the ground. We brought him back as quick as we could. You did well. Leave us now. Wait for the doctor and bring him up the moment he arrives." They retreated, and Audrey was alone with him, the silence of the room broken only by the ragged sound of his breathing. She worked with swift, practiced efficiency, stripping away his torn coat and waistcoat, examining the injuries with hands that remained steady despite the cold terror coiling in her chest. The head wound was bleeding, but not deep. The arm was likely broken. His ribs. She pressed gently along his side and heard him groan. A low, involuntary sound of pain that pierced her like a blade. Cracked. Perhaps worse. "Mrs." Dawson arrived with linens and water, and together they cleaned the blood from his face, bandaged the gash, immobilized his arm as best they could. The doctor came within the hour, a brisk, competent man who confirmed Audrey's assessment. Broken arm, cracked ribs, severe concussion. Dangerous but not fatal, provided infection did not set in, and he was kept quiet and still. Laudanum for the pain, rest, constant supervision. He'll need careful nursing, the doctor said, snapping his bag closed. Someone reliable who can monitor his condition and manage his care. Do you have family who can be summoned? His mother is in London, Audrey said quietly. I will send word, but I will manage his care until she arrives. The doctor looked at her appraisingly, then nodded. Very well, Miss Kincaid. I will return tomorrow. And so began the longest 3 days of Audrey's life. She moved into the adjoining dressing room, sleeping in brief, fitful intervals on the narrow settee so she could wake at the slightest sound. She managed the household from Lucas's bedside, dictating instructions to Mrs. Dawson, handling correspondence, ensuring that the estate continued to function smoothly despite the crisis. But her true attention was consumed entirely by the man in the bed, by the minute-to-minute cataloguing of his breathing, his color, his temperature. She bathed his face with cool cloths when fever threatened. She coaxed him to sip water and broth during the brief moments of semi-consciousness. She changed the dressing on his temple with gentle, meticulous care. And she talked to him. At first, it was only practicalities. You must drink, Mr. Fairmont, just a little. There, well done. But as the hours stretched and blurred, and exhaustion frayed the careful boundaries she had maintained for 9 years, her voice softened into something more intimate. She read to him from the book on his bedside table, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, her tone low and soothing. She told him about small, inconsequential things, the roses blooming late in the garden, the letter from the estate steward, the weather turning cooler. She spoke simply to fill the silence, to anchor him to the world, to let him know he was not alone. And something shifted. On the second night, when the laudanum had pulled him under and his breathing had finally eased into something approaching natural sleep, his uninjured hand had moved across the coverlet, searching, and Audrey had taken it without thinking. His fingers had closed around hers with surprising strength, and he had murmured something indistinct, his brow furrowing. She had leaned closer. I am here, she whispered. You are safe. I am here. His grip had tightened, and then, barely audible, he had spoken. Don't go. Her heart had stopped. I will not go anywhere. Rest now. After that, he would not settle unless she was near. When she rose to attend to some necessity, he grew restless, his breathing quickening, his head turning on the pillow as though seeking her. The moment she returned, the moment her hand touched his or her voice broke the silence, he calmed. It was instinctive, unconscious, the body's animal need for comfort in pain. But for Audrey, it was devastating. For 3 days, she was essential to him in a way she had never been before. Not invisible, not irrelevant, necessary. On the third morning, Lucas opened his eyes fully for the first time, his gaze clearing as the fog of laudanum and pain receded. Audrey was sitting beside the bed, her hand resting lightly on his uninjured arm, and when his eyes found hers, there was a flicker of recognition, of confusion, and then something that might have been gratitude. Miss Kincaid, he said, his voice hoarse and rough, you have been here. Yes, she said simply. The whole time. He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something move behind his eyes, some thought forming that he was too weak yet to voice. Then his gaze dropped to where her hand rested on his arm, and his brow furrowed, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces did not quite fit. "Thank you," he said finally, and the words were weighted with something more than courtesy. Audrey withdrew her hand gently, folding it with the other in her lap. "You are welcome, Mr. Fairmont. I'm only glad you are recovering." By evening, he was sitting up, taking broth with more appetite, asking after estate matters with his old familiar focus. And Audrey, watching him return to himself, felt the small, fragile intimacy of those 3 days already dissolving like morning mist. Soon he would be well. Soon Miss Evangeline Thorne would arrive to visit the invalid. Soon everything would return to exactly as it had been, except that Audrey would not be there to see it. By the end of the week, Lucas was out of bed, his arm bound in a sling, his movements careful but determined. The doctor had pronounced him remarkably fortunate. The ribs were healing, the concussion had left no lasting damage, and though his arm would require several more weeks of immobilization, he would recover fully. Lady Catherine had arrived from London in a flurry of anxious reproach, had satisfied herself that her son was not dying, and had departed again with instructions that he was to rest and avoid all strenuous activity. Miss Evangeline Thorne had sent a gracious note expressing concern and postponing her next visit until he was fully restored. The household had settled back into its familiar rhythms, the crisis passed, and life at Fairmont Estate resumed its ordered, predictable course. But something had shifted, though Audrey could not name it precisely. Lucas had returned to his study, to his correspondence and estate management. But there was a distraction in him now, a quality of absence even when he was present. She would find him staring out the window, his good hand resting on the desk, his expression distant and unreadable. When she brought him tea or presented letters for his signature, he would look at her with an odd intensity, as though he were seeing her for the first time and finding the sight somehow perplexing. Once, he had opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, shaking his head slightly, and returned his attention to his papers without a word. Audrey understood that the moment had come. If she delayed any longer, if she allowed the strange, fragile awareness of those 3 days to confuse her resolve, she would lose her courage entirely. She had cared for him in his vulnerability, and he had needed her, and that need had been a glimpse of something she could never truly possess. But he was well now. He would marry Miss Thorne, and Audrey had to leave before watching that future unfold destroyed what remained of her heart. She had written the resignation letter with the same painful care she had given to her acceptance of the Yorkshire post. It was brief, formal, and offered no explanation beyond the necessary facts. She thanked him for 9 years of generosity and employment, informed him that she had accepted a teaching position that would require her departure by the 28th of September, and expressed her hope that the transition would cause minimal disruption to the household. She had signed it simply, "Your obedient servant, Audrey Kincaid," and the words had blurred slightly as she wrote them, though she had blinked the weakness away. Now, on a quiet afternoon as Lucas worked in the library, Audrey stood in the doorway with the sealed letter in her hand, her heart beating with slow, heavy dread. He looked up as she entered, and something in her expression must have betrayed the significance of the moment, because his own face grew wary. "Mr. Fairmont," she said, her voice steady, despite the tightness in her throat. "I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." "Of course, Miss Kincaid." He set down his pen, giving her his full attention in that focused way he had, and she crossed the room, her footsteps soundless on the carpet. She held out the letter, and he took it, his fingers brushing hers briefly before she withdrew her hand. "What is this?" "My formal notice of resignation," she said quietly. "I thought it best to provide it in writing, so that you might have adequate time to make arrangements." For a moment, he simply stared at the sealed envelope, as though it were some incomprehensible artifact from a foreign land. Then, with deliberate slowness, he broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. Audrey watched his eyes move across the lines, once, and then again, and she saw the exact moment the meaning penetrated, the slight widening of his gaze, the tightening of his jaw, the way his good hand clenched against the edge of the desk. The silence stretched, unbearable and vast. Outside, a bird called in the garden. The clock on the mantel ticked with relentless, indifferent precision. Lucas read the letter a third time, and Audrey could see the careful control of his expression beginning to fracture, something raw and confused moving beneath the surface. "Yorkshire," he said finally, his voice strangely hollow. "A teaching post." "Yes." "When?" "The 28th of September, just over 2 weeks from now." He looked up at her then, and the expression in his eyes was one she had never seen before. Lost, almost stricken, as though she had delivered news of some catastrophic loss he could not quite comprehend. His mouth opened, closed. He seemed to be struggling for words, and she waited, her hands folded before her, her heart suspended in terrible, fragile hope that he might ask her to stay, that he might finally speak the words she had been longing to hear for 9 years. But when he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper, choked and rough. "I see." That was all. 2 words, inadequate and helpless, and she watched him fold the letter, with movements that were too precise, too controlled, the actions of a man holding himself together by sheer force of will. He placed it carefully on the desk, his hand lingering there for a moment as though he could not bear to release it. He stopped, shook his head, his breathing unsteady. "I must... excuse me." He rose abruptly, nearly knocking his chair backward, and without meeting her gaze again, he crossed the room in long, uneven strides, and left, the door closing behind him with a quiet, final sound. Audrey stood alone in the library, the afternoon light slanting through the windows, and she felt the last, fragile hope inside her collapse like ash. He had said nothing. He had fled. And in his silence, she had her answer. She pressed her hand briefly to her mouth, steadying herself against the wave of grief that threatened to break through her composure, and then she turned and walked calmly from the room, her footsteps measured and quiet, the devoted, invisible companion performing her role to the very end. Lucas fled the library with no destination in mind, only the desperate need to escape the suffocating weight of those 2 words, Yorkshire and leaving, that had somehow upended the careful architecture of his understanding. His arm throbbed in its sling, his ribs ached with each uneven breath, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the formless dread that had opened like a chasm in his chest the moment he had read Audrey's letter. He found himself in the entrance hall, staring at the polished marble floors and the grand staircase rising into shadow, and the house felt wrong, empty. Though nothing had changed, though every object remained precisely where it had always been, there was an absence in the air, a hollow quality that he could not name but felt acutely, like the pressure drop before a storm. She is leaving. The thought circled in his mind, relentless and incomprehensible. Audrey Kincaid, who had been a fixture of Fairmont Estate for 9 years, who had quietly and competently managed 1,000 invisible details of his life, was leaving. In 2 weeks, she would be gone. And he had said nothing. He had choked out 2 useless words and fled like a coward. Lucas turned and walked toward his study, seeking the refuge of familiar routine. But when he entered, the room offered no comfort. His desk. He stopped, staring at it. The correspondence was arranged in neat stacks, sorted by priority and date. His pens were lined precisely beside the inkwell, freshly cleaned. The blotter was unmarked, replaced sometime in the last day without his noticing. The lamp had been filled and trimmed. Even the books on the corner shelf were organized by subject and size, an order he had not requested but had come to rely upon without conscious thought. Audrey had done this, all of this, every day, every week, for 9 years. He moved to the small table near the window where she often sat during their evening work, and found her writing desk still positioned there, waiting. The chair cushion bore the faint impression of her presence. On the side table sat the sewing basket where she kept her needles and thread, the basket she reached for whenever she mended something of his coats, his cuffs, the torn binding of his books. He picked up the basket, running his fingers over the worn wicker, and realized with a sudden, sickening clarity that he could not remember the last time he had thanked her for any of it. The tea. God, the tea. It was always perfect. The right temperature, the right strength, appearing at his elbow precisely when he needed it without his having to ask. He had assumed it was the kitchen's doing, the general efficiency of a well-run household. But no, it was Audrey. It had always been Audrey, learning his preferences, remembering them, anticipating his needs with a care so seamless he had mistaken it for inevitability. Lucas left the study and climbed the stairs, his movements mechanical, his mind racing. He passed the drawing room and saw through the open door the pianoforte where she sat on quiet afternoons, playing soft, melancholy pieces she thought no one heard. He had heard. He had often paused in the hallway to listen, soothed by the gentle music. But he had never told her, had never acknowledged the gift of it. In the library, he found the blue shawl draped over the back of her chair near the fire. She wore it on cool evenings when they worked late, the soft wool wrapped around her shoulders, and he had grown so accustomed to seeing that particular shade of blue in his peripheral vision that its absence would be, what? Unthinkable. The house without that quiet splash of color, without her quiet presence in the corner reading or mending or simply sitting in companionable silence, was a house he did not recognize. The memories came in a flood now, relentless and unsparing. Audrey reading aloud to him on winter nights, her voice low and soothing, pulling him back from the edge of exhaustion. Audrey managing the household crisis when the cook fell ill, ensuring that everything continued smoothly, without bothering him with details. Audrey in the garden, cutting roses for the hall, her face turned toward the light. Audrey laughing, rarely, so rarely, but when she did, the sound was like sunlight breaking through clouds, and he had always found himself smiling in response without understanding why. Audrey 3 nights ago, sitting beside his bed in the dark, her cool hand on his forehead, her voice a lifeline pulling him back from pain and confusion. I am here. You are safe. I am here. And he had needed her. In his delirium, stripped of all pretense and control, he had reached for her and held on, and she had not left him. She had stayed. She had been there every time he woke, every time fear threatened, and her presence had been the only thing that mattered. Lucas sank into the chair by the library fire, his breath coming short and sharp, and the truth crashed over him with the force of a physical blow. He loved her, not the polite appreciation of a competent employee, not the mild gratitude for efficient service, but love. Absolute, consuming, undeniable love. He loved the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the grace of her movements. The way she listened to him as though his words mattered. He loved her devotion, her patience, the soft blue dresses she wore, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she concentrated. He loved her voice, her rare smiles, the presence of her in his home, in his life, in every corner of his existence. How long had he loved her? He did not know. Perhaps from the beginning, from that first day when she had stood in the entrance hall, grief pale and quietly dignified, and he had felt something shift in his chest at the sight of her. Perhaps it had grown slowly, imperceptibly, over 9 years of proximity and shared silence. It did not matter. What mattered was that he loved her now, desperately and completely, and she was leaving. She was leaving because he had been blind, because he had treated her like furniture, like an efficient mechanism of his household rather than a woman, because he had been so consumed by duty and expectation that he had failed to see the treasure he possessed. And now, in 2 weeks, she would be gone, and he would marry Evangeline Thorne in a loveless arrangement that would sentence them both to a lifetime of polite, empty partnership, and Audrey would disappear into Yorkshire, and he would lose her forever. The panic that seized him then was absolute, a terror so visceral it left him shaking. He could not let this happen. He could not lose her. The house without Audrey was not a home. His life without her was unthinkable, barren, a wasteland of duty without joy. He had to stop her. He had to tell her. But what could he possibly say that would undo 9 years of neglect? What words could bridge the chasm of his blindness? Lucas buried his face in his good hand, his breathing ragged, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt the hot sting of tears behind his eyes. He had ruined everything, and he had less than 2 weeks to find the courage to make it right. The confrontation came the next morning, though Lucas would not have called it that. Mrs. Dawson was far too subtle for direct accusations. He had been standing in the breakfast room, staring at his untouched coffee, when the housekeeper entered to clear the sideboard. She worked in silence for several moments, and Lucas sensed her disapproval in the precise, deliberate way she arranged the serving dishes. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Fairmont?" she asked, her tone perfectly proper. "No, thank you, Mrs. Dawson." She should have left then. Instead, she paused, her hands folded at her waist, her expression carefully neutral. "If I may speak plainly, sir." Lucas looked up, startled. Mrs. Dawson had been his aunt's housekeeper for 30 years, and while she managed the household with unimpeachable efficiency, she rarely offered unsolicited opinions. "Of course. I understand Miss Kincaid will be leaving us at the end of the month." The words landed like stones. "Yes, she has accepted a teaching position in Yorkshire." "I see." Mrs. Dawson's gaze was steady, measuring. 9 years of uncomplaining loyalty, and we lose her to a girls' school in the north. A great loss for Fairmont Estate. "Yes," Lucas said quietly, "it is. Your late aunt was very fond of Miss Kincaid. She believed the girl had a rare quality, devotion without expectation of reward. Not many possess such a gift, sir, and fewer still offer it so freely." She paused, and Lucas felt the weight of her unspoken meaning. One might wonder what would drive such a person to leave a home where she has been, by all accounts, content. Lucas met her eyes and saw the gentle reproach there, the knowing sadness of a woman who had observed far more than he had credited. "Mrs. Dawson." "Forgive me, sir. It is not my place." She curtsied slightly. "I only thought you should know that Miss Kincaid's departure will be felt most keenly by the entire household." She left before he could respond, and Lucas stood alone in the breakfast room, her words echoing in the sudden silence. 9 years of uncomplaining loyalty. Devotion without expectation of reward. What would drive such a person to leave? He knew. God help him, he knew. She was leaving because he had given her nothing. No recognition, no appreciation beyond perfunctory politeness, no indication that she was anything more to him than a useful fixture. She was leaving to escape the pain of loving a man who did not see her. Because she loved him. The realization struck him with absolute certainty. The 9 years of quiet service, the perfect attentiveness, the way she had cared for him during his injury with a tenderness that went far beyond duty. It was love, and he had been too blind, too consumed by his own rigid sense of obligation to recognize it. The campaign began that very afternoon, though Lucas had no clear strategy, only desperate, clumsy instinct. He found Audrey in the garden, cutting late roses for the hall, and approached her with his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Miss Kincaid. She turned, startled, the basket of roses tucked against her side. Mr. Fairmont, should you be out of doors? The doctor said, I am well enough for a short walk. He stopped a few feet away, suddenly uncertain. She looked pale, he thought, and there were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Had she always looked so fragile, or had he simply never noticed? I wanted to. That is, I hoped we might speak. Of course. She set down the basket, folding her hands before her in that familiar, composed way. Waiting. Your resignation, he began, and faltered. How did one say this? How did one ask someone to stay without revealing the desperate, newfound understanding that her absence would destroy him? I confess I was surprised. I had not realized you were unhappy at Fairmont Estate. I am not unhappy, Mr. Fairmont. Then why leave? The words came out more forcefully than he intended, almost pleading. If you are content here, if the position has been satisfactory, why accept a post so far away? She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something flicker in her eyes. Pain, perhaps, or resignation. The opportunity in Yorkshire offers me independence, a position of my own, earned by my own merits. Surely you can understand the appeal of such a prospect. Yes, but... He struggled for the right words, his usual articulate control deserting him entirely. Fairmont Estate is your home. You have been an essential part of this household for 9 years. The thought of managing without you is... He stopped, shook his head. I would be most grateful if you would reconsider. I am honored by your regard, Mr. Fairmont, but my decision is made. Audrey. Her given name escaped before he could stop it, and he saw her eyes widen, her breath catch. Miss Kincaid, please, I am asking you to stay. Why? The question was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of 9 years. Why should I stay? Because I love you. Because the house is empty without you. Because I have been a blind, selfish fool, and I cannot bear to lose you. The words crowded in his throat, demanding release, but fear held them back. Fear of rejection, of presumption, of shattering the last fragile connection between them. Because you are valued here, he said instead, and even to his own ears it sounded hollow, inadequate. Because your contributions are appreciated. She flinched, as though he had struck her, and he knew instantly it was the wrong thing to say, knew he had hurt her somehow, but he did not know how to repair it. I see, she said, her voice carefully controlled. Thank you for your kind words, Mr. Fairmont. but my answer remains unchanged. If you will excuse me, I have much to attend to before my departure." She picked up her basket and walked past him back toward the house, and Lucas stood frozen in the garden, watching her disappear, the smell of roses heavy in the air and the taste of failure bitter on his tongue. He tried again the next day, and the day after, seeking her out in the morning room, the library, the hallway outside her chamber. Each time, he attempted to broach the subject, to find some argument that would convince her to stay. But the words he needed, "I love you, I need you, please don't leave me," remained locked behind years of reserve and the paralyzing terror that speaking them would only drive her further away. And each time, Audrey listened with perfect, polite composure, thanked him for his concern, and gently, inexorably, refused. The days were slipping away. Less than a week remained. And Lucas, who had spent his entire life mastering control and duty, found himself utterly helpless in the face of the one thing that truly mattered. The morning of her departure dawned clear and golden, the late September light falling soft across the estate grounds as though nature itself were indifferent to the breaking of Audrey's heart. She had dressed with particular care in her travelling dress of deep blue wool, the colour she had worn like a quiet signature for 9 years, and stood now in the doorway of her room for the last time, her small trunk already carried down to the waiting carriage, her few remaining possessions tucked into the worn carpet-bag at her feet. There was one task left, one final, foolish gesture that she had promised herself she would not make, and yet could not leave without completing. She descended the stairs with deliberate calm, her footsteps soundless on the carpet, and made her way to the library. It was early still. Lucas would be at breakfast, or perhaps in his study reviewing correspondence, and the room was empty, filled with the particular quality of silence that belongs to spaces waiting to be occupied. She crossed to the shelf where he kept his most treasured volumes, the books he returned to again and again, and found it immediately. The worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, its leather binding soft with age and handling. From her pocket, she drew the small pressed flower she had carried with her these last 3 days, a blue forget-me-not, taken from the garden and pressed carefully between sheets of blotting paper until it was thin as parchment, fragile as her hope. The symbolism was painfully obvious. Forget-me-not, the flower of fidelity and remembrance, blue as her dress, blue as the 9 years of devotion she was leaving behind. But he would never know. He would find it someday, perhaps, pressed between the pages of his philosophy, and he might wonder briefly who had left it there before dismissing it as some servant's careless bookmark. She opened the book to the passage she knew he loved best, the meditation on acceptance and duty, and laid the flower gently against the page. Her hands trembled only slightly. Then she closed the volume, returned it to its place on the shelf, and turned away. The entrance hall was bustling with quiet, efficient activity when she descended with her carpet-bag. The footman took it with a respectful nod. Mrs. Dawson appeared, her eyes suspiciously bright, and pressed a small parcel of food into Audrey's hands for the journey. "We shall miss you, Miss Kincaid," she said softly. "More than you know." "And I shall miss you all," Audrey managed, her voice steady despite the tightness in her throat. "Thank you for everything." The carriage stood waiting in the circular drive, the horses stamping impatiently, the morning sun glinting off the polished doors. It was real now, irreversible. In moments, she would step into that carriage, and it would carry her away from Fairmont Estate, away from Lucas, away from everything she had loved in silence for 9 years. She moved toward the door, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. And in his study, Lucas reached for his Marcus Aurelius. He had not slept. The night had been an endless circuit of tortured thoughts. of arguments formed and discarded, of rehearsing words he lacked the courage to speak. Dawn had found him at his desk, staring blindly at papers that meant nothing, and in desperation he had reached for the familiar comfort of philosophy, seeking some wisdom that might guide him through the crisis of his own making. The book fell open in his hands, and the pressed flower slipped free, drifting down to land on the desk with heartbreaking delicacy. Lucas stared at it, blue, impossibly, perfectly blue, a forget-me-not. His hands shook as he picked it up, the fragile petals nearly translucent with age, preserved with painstaking care. Forget-me-not, the flower of remembrance, of faithful love, of devotion that endures beyond presence, beyond hope. Audrey had left this. Audrey, who wore blue like a signature. Audrey, who was leaving this morning. Audrey, who had loved him, and he had been too blind to see it until the moment she was walking out of his life forever. The realization shattered him. 9 years. She had loved him for 9 years, quietly, faithfully, without expectation or demand, and this flower was her final confession, the secret she would not speak aloud, but could not leave unspoken. She had given him everything, her service, her care, her heart, and he had given her nothing but polite indifference. And she was leaving. Now. This morning. Lucas surged to his feet, the flower clutched in his hand, and ran. He burst from the study, his injured arm forgotten, and raced through the hall, his heart hammering with pure, desperate terror. He could not be too late. He could not lose her. Not now. Not when he finally understood. Not when he had finally found the courage that had eluded him for 9 years. He reached the entrance hall just as Audrey stepped toward the open door, silhouetted against the morning light. "Stop!" The word tore from his throat, raw and commanding, and everything froze. Audrey turned, her eyes wide with shock. The servants stilled. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Lucas crossed the space between them in long, unsteady strides, and when he reached her, he held up the pressed blue forget-me-not, his hand shaking. "You left this," he said, his voice breaking. "In my book. You left this for me to find." Audrey's face drained of color. "Lucas?" 9 years, he said, and the words were spilling out now. Unstoppable, all the careful reserve crumbling into desperate truth. "You have loved me for 9 years, and I was too blind, too consumed by duty and expectation to see you, to see what you were offering, to see that the woman I needed, the woman I loved, was standing beside me all along." Her breath caught, tears spilling suddenly down her cheeks. "You don't mean—" "I love you." He said it clearly, loudly, for her and for the entire assembled household to hear. "I love you, Audrey Kincaid. I love your quiet strength, your intelligence, your devotion. I love the sound of your voice and the way you move through the world with such grace. I love every moment of these 9 years that I was too much a fool to cherish. And I am begging you." His voice cracked. "Please, don't leave me. Don't leave this house. Stay. Be my wife. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that I see you now, that I will never take you for granted again, that you are loved, desperately, completely loved." Audrey stood frozen, the tears streaming freely now, her composure finally, beautifully shattered. "You mean it," she whispered. "You truly mean it. With everything I am." She closed the distance between them in a rush, and Lucas caught her with his good arm, pulling her against him as she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was desperate and tender and 9 years overdue, the breaking open of everything they had both kept locked away, and Lucas kissed her back with all the passion and devotion and love he had been too frightened to acknowledge. Her hands fisted in his coat. and he held her as though she were the only solid thing in a tilting world. And when they finally broke apart, breathless and shaking, he pressed his forehead to hers. "Stay," he whispered. "Please stay." "Yes," Audrey said, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, always yes." And in the entrance hall of Fairmont Estate, before the assembled household and the waiting carriage that would now return empty to the stable, Lucas Fairmont kissed the woman in blue again, sealing the promise that would transform 9 years of silent devotion into a lifetime of acknowledged, celebrated, irrevocable love. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.